Okay, in this podcast, we're going to focus on active and passive transport. Make sure you have your podcast sheet handy, and we'll get started. So let's talk about diffusion. Now, imagine someone is cooking scrambled eggs and bacon, and you smell the aroma in your bedroom. This is diffusion. The particles in the gases, the liquids or the solids, are constantly colliding with one another in random motion. Now, diffusion is a net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Well, what does that even mean? Well, this means the bacon and eggs aroma is moving from the kitchen, an area where there is a lot of the aroma, to an area where there is less or none of the aroma. Now, no energy is required for diffusion. When the concentrations are the same in all areas, we have reached what is known as dynamic equilibrium. When this is reached and everything is the same, particles keep moving. They do not stop. Particles are still moving randomly, but there's no change in the overall concentration because dynamic equilibrium has been reached, meaning everything is the same. The aroma in the house is the same all over, both in the kitchen, the bedroom, and the rooms in between. And that is what we call diffusion. And it's simply particles moving from where there's a lot of it to where there is none of it. Now, there are factors that affect diffusion, and there are three main factors, and that is concentration, temperature, and pressure. Now, when concentration is high, there are more particles colliding, so diffusion happens quicker. When you have things bouncing all over the place and bouncing off more particles, it's going to happen a lot quicker. Now, when pressure or temperature increase, the amount of collisions also increase, and when the amount of collisions increase, it speeds up the rate of diffusion as well. Now, high pressure keeps particles closer together, and particles move quicker at higher temperatures. This results in more collisions and faster diffusion. So really, all these things focus on having more concentration, them being packed more tightly together, and that's going to cause more collisions more rapidly, and that's going to affect diffusion much faster. And it's just particles randomly colliding until dynamic equilibrium is reached. Now, I said until, and that's not technically 100% accurate because even when dynamic equilibrium is reached, they are still moving and colliding, but the net concentration is the same throughout. All right, so let's talk about facilitated diffusion. So besides water, cells also need certain ions and small molecules like chloride ions and sugars to perform certain cell functions. Now, water can diffuse across the membrane, but other things cannot. To move small molecules, facilitated diffusion is done. Well, what is that? You use what's called transport proteins. They're used to move substances across the plasma membrane. You can think of it as a VIP line or an express lane. These particles don't have to wait to randomly collide and get across the membrane. They go through the VIP line or the express lane, and that's why it's called facilitated diffusion, because there are protein pumps or protein channels. Now, substances move through a protein pump or protein channel, and it's still moving from an area to high to low concentration. Facilitated diffusion requires no energy, which is why it's still called diffusion. So diffusion is particles randomly colliding, moving from an area of high to low concentration. Facilitated diffusion, no energy, moving from high to low concentration, but it uses a VIP line or express lane, which we call protein pumps or protein channels. But when there's no energy required to move substances from high to low concentration, we call this passive transport. So diffusion and facilitated diffusion require no energy, which means they're both part of passive transport. Now, osmosis. When you hear the word osmosis, you should think one word: water. All right, osmosis is diffusion, but with water. It's the same thing, it's just strictly dealing with water. Water is the key word. So when you hear the word osmosis, you should immediately be thinking water. Now, aquaporins are channel proteins that selectively allow uncharged molecules like water to pass through. And this helps regulate homeostasis. Homeostasis being keeping everything stable inside the cell. Now, aquaporins, what does aqua mean? Aqua means water. Porins are the openings in the cell membrane. Well, what can pass through the water openings? Water. osmosis. Now, water is a solvent, and what water dissolves is known as a solute. We talked about this in the last chapter. So water diffuses where the solute is at a higher concentration until dynamic equilibrium is reached. And we're going to take a look at a couple types of solutions. We're also going to look at some illustrations, and we'll be doing this in class as well to get a better idea of how this works. All right, so isotonic and hypotonic. Now, when a cell in a solution has the same concentration of water and solutes in its cytoplasm, it's said to be isotonic. An example of this would be blood. Blood's isotonic. Iso means equal. Now, water is entering and leaving the cell at the same rate, because remember, we said it's diffusion. It's happening randomly, and when dynamic equilibrium is reached, particles are still colliding and still moving. Now, if a cell has a lower concentration, which simply means the amount of solute, is what we call hypotonic. And hypo means under or below. Water is coming into the cell. As water goes through the membrane, it creates pressure known as osmotic pressure. And that's because the cell has a lower amount of solutes. And hypo means under. So water is going to be coming into the cell. Now, in an animal cell, if the cell is extremely hypotonic, the cell might not be able to withstand the pressure, so it could swell and burst. But plant cells, remember, they're more rigid and stiff, and they have cell walls, and that can withstand the pressure, causing the cells not to swell and burst. Now, plants fill their vacuoles with water that push the membrane out towards the cell wall, making the plants firmer. And this is why grocery stores mist their produce. Sometimes if you go Publix, Walmart, you may see, or even Winn-Dixie, you might see some mist sprays. Other times people simply water, and that's so the produce looks fresher longer. All right, let's talk about hypertonic. Now, if the concentration of a solute is higher on the outside of the cell than inside, then the cell has been placed in a hypertonic solution. Hyper means above. The net movement of water is going out of the cell. Now, animal cells in a hypertonic solution shrivel because of decreased pressure. Water is moving out. Plant cells in a hypertonic solution lose water from their vacuole because water is going out of the cell. Now, the plasma membrane shrinks from the wall, and this causes wilting among the plant cells. All right, so here we have a illustration. Here we have water coming into a cell, water coming out of a cell, and here we have the solutes. So in an isotonic solution, iso meaning equal, water molecules move into and out of the cell at the same rate, and cells retain their normal shape. The animal cell and the plant cells have their normal shapes in an isotonic solution, animal cells being more round, plant cells being more rectangular. So here they have retained their normal shape. But if we move to a hypotonic, hypo meaning under, water enters a cell by osmosis, causing the cell to swell. And that's because in a hypotonic solution, we have less water, we have more solutes. So inside this cell, we have a lot more solutes than outside the cell. And because there's a lot more solutes in here, there's a lower amount of water, tonic referring to the liquid inside. So there's going to be a greater amount of water coming into the cell than leaving the cell. So in a hypotonic solution, water enters a cell by osmosis, causing the cell to swell. Animal cells may continue to swell until they burst. Plant cells swell beyond their normal size as internal pressure increases. So here we can see that it's really starting, the plant cells are really starting to swell. Those messages from my inbox are distracting me, throwing me off track. But we can see they're starting to swell, where in the previous picture, they retain their normal shape. We have some space, but in here, there's a little bit less space. They're coming closer together, and that's because in a hypotonic solution, there's less water, more solutes, the tonic referring to the water, so there's a great amount of water coming into the cell. Now, in a hypertonic solution, that means there is more water in the cell than there is out here, and water will be leaving the cell because there are more solutes outside the cell. So water will be leaving the cell to make it equal, try to make it isotonic. Now, in a hypertonic solution, water is leaving the cell by osmosis, and that's going to cause the cell to shrink. Animal cells shrivel up as they lose water, and here you can see plant cells have lost that internal pressure, and they're really starting to shrink where they were earlier. You can still see their cell walls here, but you can see the cell membranes are starting to shrink away from that cell wall. So in a hypertonic solution, there's more water inside the cell than there is outside the cell. There are more solutes outside the cell, so water is going to move out and try to balance that out. Now, let's talk about active transport. So we talked about passive, which means no energy. Active transport requires energy. So do not abbreviate active transport as ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is a fancy way of saying energy. If you abbreviate ATP or active transport as ATP, you're going to confuse it later on. They're two different things, although they are related. Now, sometimes things move from an area of low concentration to an area of higher concentration. And this goes against what is known as the concentration gradient, and it requires energy. Going against the flow. If you've been in a lazy river, you may have turned around and gone against the river. You're going against the flow, and that requires energy because you're moving from an area of low to high concentration. Now, in diffusion and passive transport, we move from an area of high to low. In active transport, it's the other way around, from low to high. Now, when energy is required, we call it active transport rather than passive transport. Active transport helps maintain homeostasis and moving things in and out of the cell based on what the cell needs. So active transport active transport requires energy, which is ATP. Large particles. So some substances are too large to move through diffusion. It won't work. Substances go into the cell through what is known as endocytosis and exit the cell through exocytosis. Now, in endocytosis, a cell surrounds the substance that is outside the cell. It encloses it in a portion of the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. The membrane then pinches off and leaves the substance in the cell. That is when something is entering the cell. In exocytosis, the removing of particles is done through the membrane the same way, except instead of coming in, it is going out. Cells use exocytosis to secrete waste and substances such as hormones that the cell has made. Now, both endocytosis and exocytosis are active transport. This means they require energy. So with active transport, we have things moving from low to high concentration, moving against the concentration gradient. That requires energy, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is a fancy way of saying energy. Endo and exocytosis are an example of that. We have diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis, which is passive transport, require no energy, and moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Osmosis deals strictly with water. Facilitated diffusion is the same thing as diffusion, but uses a protein pump or protein channel. And diffusion is the random collision of particles until things reach dynamic equilibrium. They do not use protein pumps or protein channels. So that is going to be it for this section. If you have any questions, please write them down. Become ready to apply these concepts and not just say what they mean. We'll see you guys in class.